How are you?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. Very well, thank you. And thanks for coming on.
Anytime.
Well, look, I'm a huge fan of the work you guys put together with the report. Read it several times and sent it to my entire team and portfolio companies, and also sent it to my parents on WhatsApp as well. So, huge fan of the report. Thank you for putting that together. It came just at the right time. I'd like to just kick off with a few questions, and then would hopefully take questions from the audience. But before I do that, maybe just give you a minute to introduce yourself and just give any opening remarks if you'd like to.
Absolutely. Kola, thank you so much for having Yaka and Wasan and the team, both the Parity and TechCabal that put this together. It's really fun to be with you here today. I'm an associate partner in the Nairobi office of McKinsey. I spend half my time in the public sector and half my time in the private sector supporting governments, agricultural input companies, so seeds, fertilizer, crop protection, all the way into the retail end of the value chain. I serve some restaurants and quick service chains as well, just helping them really serve their farmers and their customers better. I've also, I guess, the report that you sent to your parents over WhatsApp, I'm glad somebody reads these reports. I'm one of the lead authors of McKinsey's 2, soon to be 3. You heard it here first. We're releasing the next report, hopefully tonight or first thing on Monday morning.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. And that's a really great way to segue into my first question, right? So, the report sort of came about just, about a week after Nigeria, a week or two after the Nigerian lockdown, for instance, started. What has changed since that report was published? Very often, for those of us that write, when you publish a blog post, a couple of weeks later, you often feel like you want to go as it was published. And I know you probably don't want to give it all away, but do you just want to comment on that briefly?
The one thing that is certain in this crisis is that everything changes all the time. As we were writing it and trying to get to publication, I was like, guys, I think I have to go out today because tomorrow something's going to have changed. So maybe let me share the first report was really trying to size the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19 in Africa. And there were 3 big drivers of that impact. The first was recording global COVID impact, which looks at things like exports, particularly non-oil exports. It looks at FDI flows. And then finally, it looks at what else is going to happen with actually input supply chains, right? On that front, what has changed since the last report is China's supply chains actually opening up. And so the impact, we said maybe this is going to go on for 2 quarters, maybe 3. In the case of China, this actually bounced back faster than we anticipated. But in other parts of the world, it looks like the COVID crisis is going to prolong the disruption of those value chains. That has changed. We've not seen much movement and changes in FDI and its sentiment around FDI. We've seen bounce back in some non-oil exports. So Kenya, for example, we are now back to about 70% of pre-COVID crisis levels for food exports. Flowers are still sort of pretty much down for the year. So we've seen some movement in the global trends. The domestic impact of COVID, which is the second bucket we looked at, and also the biggest driver of our model, about 60% of the impact we're seeing across the continent was the second domestic COVID, which looked at the impact of reduced travel and movement, as well as the impact of what we called consumer spend reductions. Work from home for us when the average laborer is earning less than $2 a day, right? And cash-based income meant just complete stop and work. That actually the outlook is looking progressively worse, actually, for a lot of our countries. While we're starting to reduce lockdown restrictions within country, so Ghana, I think, was the first to do that. We're seeing some of that happen in Kenya as well. The economic impact is going to be longer and deeper than we had originally anticipated. The final thing was then around oil, and who knows what's going to happen with oil. That was the last biggest impact. Your guess is as good as mine what's going to happen with oil prices tomorrow. Those are some of the changes that we've seen since we looked at the report.
Brilliant. So China has proven to be much more resilient but we haven't seen the same levels of resilience across the African continent. Now, before I go to my next question, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you haven't read the report, there are links to the report in the chat. So please open that up and so you can follow the conversation. Now, at Ventures Platform, we announced 3 new investments yesterday. One in a company based out of Kenya, another in a company in Nigeria, and one in a company that operates globally. I got a few DMs from some fellow investor friends that, are you guys still investing? And so I guess the question I'd like to throw to you is, given the fact that the resilience we're seeing across Africa isn't where we would hope it would be, do you think we should? Do you think this is time to invest, or should we be more cautious as VC funds in Africa?
Let me caveat this to the nth degree. I'm not an investor. All my investment advice I get from my former roommate. But here's what I can tell you I'm seeing, particularly in the food space. So I work closely or interact closely with companies like Twiga, Soko, in the ag value chain. People have to eat, right? That is for certain, for sure going to be the case. And in fact, the ag sector, more than other sectors, has not seen as deep an impact from COVID, particularly in Africa. A lot of our farmers are smallholder farmers, right? A lot of the changes in demand for agriculture are much longer term. It's population growth and income. That's what drives consumption for agriculture. And then some of the movements we're seeing on the stock market in ag commodities is not as high. So I think it makes sense to continue investing in things that people will continue to need, right? Particularly because a slowdown in agricultural production and anything that follows that similar trend is only going to come and bite us 2-3 months from now, right? We still need to plan now. So I think those investments should continue to happen. And if I can quote one of my friends who is much more of an investor than I am, right? It's risky everywhere, is his point. So
that's right.
Where are you going to place your bets? Are you going to place your bets on a continent whose fundamental drivers of demand continue to be quite robust, right?
There you go.
Where we've proven time and time again, take big companies, take small companies, if you invest in the continent and take a long-term view, you too may be Dangote, right? So I think it's risky everywhere. You just, what is your appetite to invest?
Again, the fundamentals continue to be there, the youthful population, the growth. And so it's really about, your perspective. Thanks for just echoing something I shared in the keynote a few minutes ago. Now, from your view, how would you assess the response of the tech ecosystem across Africa so far? Obviously there have been some specific COVID-related initiatives. We've seen work with CC Hub. At Ventures Platform, we did a innovation challenge. And there's been lots of activity. We've also seen some companies become more missional. Companies like M Pharma in Ghana, companies like MDAS in Nigeria. How would you say how would you assess the response of the tech ecosystem across the continent?
I love these questions. I told you I'm not a tech expert, but let me opine. So I think there's 2 tensions I'm seeing in the response of the tech ecosystem, maybe 3 actually. So number 1 is COVID is showing us that responses have to be very, very localized. And when you talk about what a localized intervention looks like, in Kenya, right, when we think about anything to do with dispersing fiscal stimulus and businesses that I've seen try and pivot their business models, we have a payment system that works for end user, last mile, both vulnerable populations and small businesses. The sort of intervention we designed there will be very different from, for example, what we did in Togo, where Togo actually used the voters register and worked with a local telco using the voters register as a way to identify people who would need support. So I think that's one thing the tech ecosystem is responding quite well to, but it's sort of not at odds, but doesn't necessarily lend itself naturally to scaling. That's the other challenge in a crisis like this one, right? Is that designs have to be very, very localized, very specific to the participants or the users you're trying to reach. Cognizant that it's so dynamic, their needs are changing every day, the crisis is changing every day, but you also want to be able to get scalable solutions because our estimates from the first McKinsey report, actually the second one, which I just put in the chat window, is that 1/3 of employment is at risk across the continent, right? That's like 150 million people. So we need solutions at scale. So the response to scale, I think, has to be very different to the response from the tech ecosystem on localized solutions. The third thing I would then say is just the regulation that's going to underpin tech innovations. Because, I don't know, is data now essential service? The things that are preventing us from getting access and the cost of data, and what is the line we're going to draw between a pay stack and an M-Pesa and a bank. I think those three things sort of have to work together.
Brilliant, brilliant. Now, you talk about scale, and I really like that, the need for scale, right? But, on the flip side, there's also the concern that, some of the technology adoption that we're seeing, COVID accelerates. Will it remain post-pandemic, or would people, just default to their traditional ways of cash, of not wanting to pay online? How much of this behavioral change do you see? And I think this is particularly critical for the entrepreneurs in the room. How much of this behavioral change do you see sticking around post-COVID, post-pandemic?
Yeah. So I think it depends on how long this pandemic lasts, because it takes a while to change human behavior, right? And behavior can change when 3 or 4 things happen. Number one is you have a case for change, which is what we have very much so now. I'll keep giving you ag examples. That's what I know, right? We've seen vendors in open markets who are very quickly moving to online demand channels, right? Companies like Twitter are saying they're seeing just acceleration in registration on their platform more than ever before. Speaking with Amandla Ooko-Ombaka from Paystack, saying the same thing. The number of merchants that people are onboarding is super, super fast. So the case for change is there. So, we need that case for change. Will it continue to be there? Potentially, right? If we're still in this situation, 12 months from now, that case for change will still be there. The second thing I think is that systems have to be in place to enable that behavior change. Now, it's okay if for a short period of time, which is what we're doing right now with a lot of the responses we're supporting both private sector and government with, is running these nerve centers, right? Or control towers that can very quickly make decisions that would otherwise take a very, very long time. That, I don't know if that's sustainable. If the infrastructure of our organization is that everything is siloed, then the crisis ends and you go back to being siloed. So I think you have to create the enabling environment for these changes to continue happening. The third and final thing is very much our mindset, right? I think we have a massive opportunity coming out of a crisis like this to fundamentally change a lot of things. Again, I'll bring ag examples because that's what I know. What is the market of the future, right? The fact that 60% of people are buying their food in open markets where we're not able to maintain sanitation controls. This time it's COVID, right? I don't know. Next year it might be locust. It might be fall. Are we going to rise to this challenge and really take the time to question how our supply chains work, how we actually deliver customer services as businesses, as governments? And if we do, then I think, we'll see this behavior change because it's not a push model, it's a pull model.
You talk about we, are we going to, who is we, and who galvanizes the private sector, the startups, the investors? Again, I guess I'm pointing my fingers at governments. What is the role of Africa's governments in accelerating this adoption and ensuring that it sustains? In Nigeria, for instance, I'll speak about that. I know in Kenya as well, there's been committees that have been set up by ministries and departments. I happen to sit on one of the committees to look at how government can support the tech ecosystem. But this conversation so far have not really looked, at least the ones I've been a part of, haven't looked at how you really start to galvanize more adoption and ensure it sustains post the pandemic. Now, on the flip side, in some countries, we're also seeing a clampdown. And this is speaking to Farouk Adeshina's question. We're seeing a clampdown of governments. How do we communicate to government, and what role do governments need to play?
Yeah, so I like to describe myself as someone that has a public sector heart and a private sector mind. And I think the government has a massive role to play. But we as citizens, you guys as investors and as businesses, need to, one, be very clear what your priorities are, right? I think that this crisis is an opportunity for people to come together and say, as startups in this ecosystem, this is what we need. I think that it's important to then support government with data, right? So when this lockdown happened in East Lee, I reached out to folks like Twiga and Copia that are, truth be told, a small part of the market, but they can geolocate all of their traders. And so if you have data like that you think can help government with their responses, I think we need to share that with government. There's a whole issue about data privacy and data standard sharing, et cetera. Let's use this as an opportunity to accelerate those conversations, right? And then finally, I think we have to understand that this is a conversation, right? Government, I think, is fantastic in facilitating. In my mind, government does this, not this, right? So bringing together people, setting the agenda,
that's right, as a facilitator,
right? Make it very clear what government's goal is, and get that conversation going. We can't just say, look, we have a problem, our exports cannot come in, let's talk to government now. When times are good, we're okay, we don't want to deal with government, right? So that conversation has to really be ongoing.
That's right. Now, so the tech ecosystem must move away, in my view, from take and ask to actually becoming more missional. And so, in doing that, we with this pandemic and the effects, the economic effects of it, there are forecasts that job losses might be in the hundreds of millions across the continent. What role do you think technology plays in sort of activating jobs or new kinds of jobs as we look to the future?
Yeah, this is the question that just keeps me up at night.
And I'd like you to sort of talk through the lens of the informal sector, particularly.
This question keeps me up at night, honestly, Kola, because the only way we get out of this crisis is jobs. The only way we grow our economy is jobs, right? And I think it's really challenging. The crisis we're facing in COVID is unlike anything we've seen from an economic perspective. I mean, everybody keeps quoting the 1918 Spanish influenza. But the reason is because it's a supply side shock is what's happening to across a lot of our economies. And we're so dependent on what's happening in China, that supply side shock is the first thing we feel before this depressions of demand. So all this is, I think, is going to go on for a while. What can tech's role be? Number one, I think, is inclusivity. So as much as like Silicon Savannah, all these wonderful things are happening, right? The number of people that have coverage but not actual access to internet and mobile is still staggering on the continent, 800 million people. So there's no way tech can be inclusive if we don't make sure people actually have access to tech, which is part of regulatory issue, right? It's a cost issue about bringing things down, but it's really, we need to make sure technology in the hands of people to be inclusive in these jobs in the informal sector in particular. The second thing I would say is, and this is for government in particular, you cannot force SMEs to formalize by decree. I say formalize and SMEs formalize. So I think there's a role for government to say, even if SMEs are not formalized, how can we continue to provide services that support them? So number one, is there a form of registration you can get that would allow you to get a stimulus during this period of time or a loan? But that means that if you apply and you employ a certain number of people, you have some sort of tax benefit over a period of time, right? So I think increasing the rate of registration so you can give people services is important. How far you go in formalization, I think, is very much an open question, and we'll stand to see, but I think technology can be critical there. Again, I'll bring up the Paystack example where companies like Paystack that actually have a lot of information, data, Safaricom, about business transactions, much more informative than any of these people filing tax returns, right? So I think there's a role for tech companies that have high volume, high transaction data to think about how they help SMEs formalize. And then the final thing which you mentioned is about reimagining what the future can be like, right? I don't know if education will ever be the same again, right? We thought we could never go fully digital in education, and that's now happening. But we need to be inclusive about it. So I think the tech ecosystem can really help us think about what's a second, third, fourth iteration of things we're likely to see. So as we make these changes to regulation, as we make these changes to formalization, we're not thinking about 2 years from now, right? We're thinking about 3, 4, 5 years from now.
Sure. Right. Well, we have about 10 more minutes, and there's so many questions. I just want to take one last question from my pile before I go into the other questions. Now, one of my favorite parts of the report was, the analysis you did regarding what economic outcomes we can expect across various scenarios, looking at Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. And the case for Nigeria particularly was troubling for me because you surmise that slice or dice, whatever way the coin lands, it's economic bleeding for the future. For startups and founders in this conference, and investors as well who operate Pan-African, what should be the takeaway? Should we be tilting more towards East Africa or South Africa and less of Nigeria, or what should we do? How should we respond?
Yeah. So, the first thing is that every country's impact on COVID is going to be very different. And so understanding that as you guys do your planning on where you invest, where you potentially pivot the products you're designing, the channels you're using, your business models, the impact is very different. So the Nigeria case, Nigeria was starting from a much lower projected base of growth than Kenya, for example, right? By 3%, 3 percentage points, number one. The oil impact in Nigeria is actually a negative impact, right, for the overall economy, but it's a very positive impact in Kenya, right? The import bill actually goes down. So that's the first step, just being very clear that impacts are very different. The second takeaway is then, depending on your sector, what is the type of response that you will require, right? Because as I mentioned, the way you would respond to this may require you to accelerate what you're already planning to do, right? So it's not a thing in your business model now just get pulled forward because the case for change has come. Or you need a completely different product, which you may be able to do with your current set of people, with your current tech infrastructure. It may be that you just need to change channels and really very quickly go into a different channel than what you had perceived before. Then the second takeaway, right? It's not all things for all people. And then the third, I guess, is you all picked a very tough life when you decided to be entrepreneurs. I've been a corporate baby my whole life. So I wish you Godspeed. I wish you courage. I think that what you guys are doing is really, really hard, but also very, very necessary to come up with the ideas that are going to take us into the future. So please stay steadfast. And if you need to move back home with your mother so that you can be fed and have a roof over your head, do what is necessary to keep your businesses going, to pay your employees. I appreciate it super, super hard.
There's no time more than now that I've heard the retorts that entrepreneurship is overrated. And thanks for passing us the box of tissue. Now, just in shifting gears a little bit, there's a question here that I think really sort of lends some support to what you just said, which is really that there's a bit of a conundrum, right? There's some folks that are pushing for economies to be opened up soon, for lockdowns to be raised, but the effect of that really is this digital sort of transformation or rise in adoption was seen, then sort of starts to slow. So for companies who might be looking at allocating capital towards product verticals that rely on the growth in digital because of the lockdown, how do they make that decision? Is this do you flip the switch or on expenditure, or do you wait and see? Again, this speaks to the balance, the economic and the health balance of locking down or yeah.
So the stark reality is that our economies cannot handle lockdowns for prolonged periods of time, right? When your options are I think the fatality rate of COVID now and across the continent is 7 or 8% of fatalities from COVID, which is, I'm not trivializing that, but when you compare that to malaria, when you compare that to hunger, right? 70% of Kenyans in peri-urban areas are missing more than one meal a day, right? So when that's what you're comparing things to, we just don't have the capacity to sustain lockdowns. So I think what we're likely to see is periods of opening up, and where we can contain the spread of the virus, things stay open. When cases begin to rise again, the government may take some measures to curtail things again, like South Africa's tier 1 to tier 4 system. What's actually pretty troubling, actually, when I was looking at the statistics of case numbers as testing has increased, we're starting to see cases in Nigeria accelerate, right? For a long period of time, we said, Africa, we're not seeing this takeoff we've seen anywhere else, right? We're running a tenth the tests. Even our best-in-class testing is significantly below where global averages are. So I think we're going to see a period of opening and then curtailing a bit. And so in that, just pace yourselves, I think would be my advice. If you wait too long, you're going to miss the wave for the period that it's there. If you act too fast and don't pace yourselves, you're going to run out of steam. And so I think if we consider the fact that we'll be doing this for a while, then that's, I think, how we plan.
Sure, brilliant. I mean, one way I like to look at it is you have to think long term, but sort of plan short term, and it's sort of that striking that balance that's really critical.
Maybe one thing, right? I think there's a lot of, I'm looking at all the members of the group here. We're all young. We have incredible privilege to be where we are today, right? That we can sit here and not worry about our internet running out, put on nice headphones, have this conversation. I would just hope that even as we think about ideas for our businesses, even as we think about the appeals we're making to government, the vast majority of the continent does not have the privileges that you and me have sitting here. And so in our small part, whatever it is that we're doing, right? If it's your SCARI, right? If it is the informal sector workers who are supporting your businesses, whatever it is that you can do to make your part, make someone's life better, even if it feels small, can make a world of difference. This problem we have ahead of us is enormous, right? Sometimes I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I don't know how I'm gonna get out of bed today because I have no idea how I can do my job, where I'm telling countries, right, that things are looking bad for years to come. But I just implore us all here, yes, we're trying to change the world, but the world is like individuals in our communities that we should really be looking out for.
Thanks, Amandla. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And this is the end of the conversation. Take care. Yeah. Bye.